Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two. All right, we will, in respect of everyone's time, we'll get started. I'm sure some others will join us as we get going, but welcome everyone. My name is Elana Kieffer. I'm so happy to, I can't see you all, but to be with you all today. I am the director of the Center for Healthy Aging at the New York Academy of Medicine. We are located in East Harlem, and our mission is to advance health equity. And specifically at the Center for Healthy Aging, we are focused on the 65 plus population. So today we have a jam-packed webinar. You can see here it is all about resilience in the wake of disasters and emergencies, with the focus on older adults in New York State. And in addition to me speaking, I am joined by two esteemed colleagues, Danielle Arigoni from the National Housing Trust and Robyn Haberman from AARP New York. And all of our presentations complement each other on this overarching theme, and you'll hear a lot more from each of us shortly. But first, I want to just kind of set the tone for today. This webinar was brought about because we at NYAM developed an update to a report that was written by NYAM almost 10 years ago in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, when unfortunately older adults were disproportionately impacted by that weather emergency. And we at NYAM, before my time actually, did a very comprehensive report to better understand why that was and how we can ensure that older adults, their loved ones, and those who work with them have the tools that they need to be prepared within a resilient framework in future emergencies. And of course, we had a major emergency over the last several years with the pandemic. And so we realized that we needed to make some updates and tweaks to the report to incorporate that. And so now I'm just going to briefly turn it over to my coworker, Carolyn Stem, who actually developed the idea for this update, to say a few words.
Thank you, Elana, and thank you all for being here. Resilience, what a powerful word for the human being. Resilience, not thought of too often when we're young. Oh boy, do we think about it when we're older. We begin to really define what that word means. Hurricane Sandy taught us the true meaning of that word. We were devastated at NYAM after realizing the horrors of that storm, especially affecting our beloved seniors. Our age-friendly team, whose passion was working with older adults throughout the boroughs, went right to work, hoping to piece together a plan to help our older generation become aware of safety and planning regarding this disaster and future disasters. Lindsay Goldman, a former staff member and later director of NYAM's Age Friendly, worked tirelessly to research and put together our first report, Resilient Communities Empowering Older Adults in Disasters and Daily Life, never even thinking that we would have such a tragic disaster as a worldwide pandemic. The countless dead of this pandemic were almost immeasurable, both young and old. It was time. We turned to our report and augmented it so that this unimaginable tragedy was included in our research and outreach to the public. We were told that the older population, many of those who did survive the pandemic, seemed to be stronger of will and knowledge, even more so than many of the younger population. Resilience is what our older generation showed. Their age, their wisdom, and hopefully our first report I am proud of our second report, Strengthening Community Resilience, Supporting Older Adults Through Emergency Preparedness and Response in a Post-COVID Era, and hope it will give additional strength to our people. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Elana, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I forgot to mention that Carolyn has been with the New York Academy of Medicine, really pushing our age-friendly agenda for the last 15 years. And we really thank you for all of that work and for your continued work, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I also forgot to mention that we will have a Q&A portion at the end. So if you want to put any questions, you can just put that right in the chat, and the panelists will receive it, and then we will choose our favorite questions to answer at the end. Next slide, please. Great. And so I'm going to talk right now about our specific report. So Musa, you can go to the next slide after this. So as Carolyn mentioned, the original report in 2014 came out of the Superstorm Sandy, which happened in 2012. You can see here, I'm sure there are many people on this call that remember this. And as I mentioned, it really, for many reasons, disproportionately impacted older adults. Press next, Musa, for the animation. And this was our original report. And one more time, which is available online. There is a lot of really rich information in here. And as Carolyn also mentioned, Lindsay Goldman, who worked at NYAM for many years, spearheaded this huge effort, had multiple focus groups with older adults, and key informant interviews with many different stakeholders across New York City. And it's really a very comprehensive report. I encourage you to check it out. And again, was really coming from a resilient framework. What can older people teach all of us about the best way to survive during these types of emergencies, and as it says in the title, in daily life as well. Next slide, please. And perhaps one of the best things to come out of this report was the development of our Image NYC map. So again, I can't see you all, but I imagine some of you on this call have used our Image NYC map. You can see a screenshot of it here. It is a map that displays many different sociodemographic characteristics of adults in New York age 65 and older, and with an overlay of services and resources that are often beneficial to older adults and to caregivers. And this map came about from the original report because we realized that there was so much information we did not know about older New Yorkers, and there are so many different types of older New Yorkers. So we really wanted to understand different sociodemographics related to race, language, socioeconomic status. Do they live alone? Do they live with a spouse? Where do they live? Many different points. And then also, as you can see here, those little purple icons are naturally occurring retirement communities. And then the little blue icons that are harder to see are what are called elder justice centers. So again, you can begin to get a sense of where are older adults. The blue shading throughout the map, in this particular case, just shows the percentage of adults age 65 and older. So when you have a higher percentage, you want to make sure you have a high number of services and resources for older adults. So I encourage you to check out our map. We're happy to provide a training on how to use it. We do it all the time. And we're always updating the map with relevant information from the census and from other sources as well. Next slide, please. So we realized, as I mentioned, that there was a need for an update. We had, as you can see here in these very depressing but really true blocks on the screen, many new and some ongoing issues that were directly impacting older adults and people of all ages, but particularly related to the pandemic. And then, of course, all of these different issues are even more disproportionately impacting certain populations along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. And so we knew that we had a lot of work to do in this area. Next slide. And so we made our report. You can see it here, and Musa, just click twice, please. So this report is, of course, available online. We just released it within the last few weeks, and that is, and I'll talk in the subsequent slides about what is included in the report. But as you can see, it really is an update. It's a pared down version of the original report. It is really taking pandemics, both current, past pandemics, and hopefully not, but perhaps future ones, into account, because of course, any kind of emergency response for a pandemic is going to be different for something like a hurricane. And I, of course, want to give a huge shout out to our two key partners on this work. We worked closely with JASA, which is a very large multi-service senior organization based in Manhattan, but they really do work all across the city. And we worked with them to hold our focus groups. And so we had focus groups in their older adult centers and their naturally occurring retirement communities, which are buildings where a large proportion of the tenants in a building are older themselves. And so those buildings are able to sometimes receive funding to provide basic social services geared towards older adults. And all of this project and work was funded by the New York Community Trust, and we give a big thank you to them as well. Next slide, please. So really the goal of our report was to do a literature review to kind of understand what has been researched in this area already. And you can see here how we did that. What is already the data out there from the census and from other sources to really kind of understand the landscape of older adults in New York City, and then to really just meet with older adults who, again, know best. We all experienced the pandemic. We've all experienced climate change issues. And if we want to work together, the only way to work together is to learn from older adults about the best responses within this resilience framework. So this was our process. And you can see here on the right-hand side that our kind of guiding framework was this what's called the RAND Corporation's framework for community resilience. And so we really used kind of those guiding principles as we shaped our results and our recommendations. Next slide. So what did we learn? Next slide, please. So after the focus groups, after the key informant interviews, after the research that we did, we came up with a number of different kind of themes and results. And the first one we found was the importance of partnerships. And partnerships can mean a lot of things. You can see here, we outlined some of the important partners that really, again, work hand in hand with older adults, with family members, with formal and informal caregivers, to ensure that older adults have what they need during any type of emergency. And just as some examples, one key informant interview talked about working with a borough president's office, and that borough president's office provided a small grant to some local community-based organizations in that borough to provide vaccine education. And again, we have to, local government is so important for many reasons, both in terms of allocated funds, but also in terms of resources themselves. And that is one key partnership. Another example related to peer-to-peer support is just really the power of just connecting and the power of sharing resources. And I'm sure we all saw this during COVID, people of all different ages. And one older adult in a focus group said that she got food that she couldn't eat. So she called some friends and said, hey, I'm not going to eat this, but I'm able to give it to you. And so again, it's just that kind of sharing, connecting, which is both helpful in terms of, in this case, sharing food, but that is hopefully unused, but also to have that social connection. Next slide, please. Education. So in this case, the next theme was education. And what we mean here specifically is education around emergency preparedness and emergency response. So kind of similar to what I was saying before, although actually one-on-one communication is sometimes with service providers and older adults. Many older adults take advantage of the really robust services that we have here in New York City specifically, but also really across the country with senior centers in New York City. They're called older adult centers, and many other types of institutions and organizations. And the staff there can be a really key messenger for providing that type of education. And many people that I know that worked at older adult centers in New York City, they would just do check-ins, just say, how are you doing? What do you need? Do you have enough masks? Do you have test kits? So that in itself can just be like really important, both for the social connection and the practical connection. One thing I know certainly my generation doesn't think a lot about is cable access television. However, it can be really quite beneficial. And one focus group participant said that they announced the food distribution at local schools right on cable TV. That's the only way that I knew about it. So just as a reminder that social media is very important. Smartphones are really important. We need all of them, but sometimes we want to think about different modes of communication to reach the most number of people. Next slide. Another theme that came about was efficiency. And here we're talking about efficiency of services. When you have this kind of global emergency where everyone is in need, the services have to be efficient in order to reach the most number of people. So again, is one example, one related to those kind of like calls and those wellness checks, and really just kind of, especially for older adults that are connected to some type of organization. We had one staff member talk about that she said we learned from Hurricane Sandy to have a list of our clients that we serve, their home phone number, their address, and their level of frailty, and if they need a walker or a cane or some type of assistive device. So we have that list both in hard copy and then also on the computer, because you never know. So that again is an example of really trying to be ensure that you have what you need, especially ahead of time of an emergency, so that you can, again, triage when an emergency does happen. And then the other thing that, again, I'm sure is not news to anyone here, but a lot of community-based organizations, and especially senior centers and older adult centers, really quickly and quite beautifully, in my opinion, transitioned from in-person to virtual programming. And that, again, was a way to emit information and education, but also to provide social connection and a way for staff in particular to also kind of visually see how their clients were doing. And this is not always easy. And there's a lot of different elements to that related to Wi-Fi access and digital learning. But for those that did, for those that were able to, I think it was really quite a blessing. And I know that many organizations, and of course work, have really transitioned to either full virtual programming or at least some type of hybrid model. Next slide, please. And then the last kind of general theme was around access. And so that's really around ensuring availability both to high quality physical health services, mental health services, and also social services. So, this relates to ensuring that older adults were able to easily get the vaccine. And I know it was a long time ago, but at the time when vaccines were first coming on board, there was a mad rush. There was a lot of questions around how to get it. How do I sign up? What if I'm not comfortable signing up online? What does this vaccine mean? And one organization actually hired staff specifically to help older adults sign up for the vaccine and also help them to get to the vaccine clinic. Another thing when we think about kind of just access both to services and opportunities for social connection was during the height of the pandemic. I don't know if it was some or all, but there were certainly some buses that provided free fares. And that, again, is another way, especially if people are struggling financially, to be able to get out of their apartment and go to the doctor's office, go to a vaccine site if need be, go visit a friend. Again, we heard that that free bus fare really made a huge difference. And then the other thing, again, was the social connection. And specifically, it's very common in New York City to live in an apartment building. And while, of course, that often means smaller square footage than in other parts of the state, the flip side is that you have people right on your floor that are very easy to connect with. And of course, during something like a pandemic or certainly a weather emergency, if you can do it safely, it actually can make for easier social connection when your neighbor is literally just one door down. Next slide, please. So then the other thing that you'll see in the report is we give a number of concrete recommendations. And these are just a few of them that we just highlighted here related to the results. So, in terms of partnerships, ensuring that you're consulting with older adults in your community or in your organization, again, to find out what was most useful to them. In terms of education and planning, make sure that you have an emergency plan, the older people in your life have an emergency plan, you know where those plans are, and that you're working on those plans during non-emergency times. In terms of efficiency, one recommendation, I know that there were so many concerns around food and home delivered meals. And so, one suggestion is to do this kind of like in real time assessment of the home delivered meal program and seeing, is there too much food being delivered to one building and not enough to another, for as one example, in order to eliminate food waste and make sure that everyone gets the food that they need, because so many older adults rely on those home delivered meals. And then, of course, with access, it's the digital access is only as good as if people are trained in how to use it and have the Wi-Fi in order to access anything online. And so, there are certainly, let's say, like affordable senior housing sites, older adult centers, and other spaces where older adults congregate. And those are great places. Some of them already are connected with organizations like OATS with AARP that provide excellent training in technology. And then also to make sure that there is Wi-Fi and there are different kind of programs available. And sometimes they are free or discounted to ensure that people are able to get online. Next slide, please. So just as a wrap up for my portion, again, the report is available online. And as we were writing the report, we realized that we want to make sure that while this report is geared more towards aging service professionals, we want to make sure we have all this good information, that it's also that we're able to share that with older adults directly. So we developed a guide sheet, both in English and in Spanish, and the guide sheet's available online, but we will also actually be mailing it out to older adult centers and to other community-based organizations that work with older adults, so that they can have something in hand, put on the fridge, with really different kind of concrete recommendations, again, within that kind of resilience framework, to help prepare older adults for any type of future emergency. So with that, keep the questions and comments coming in the chat. I've been monitoring them, and I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Arigoni for her portion.
Thank you, Elana, and thanks everyone for being here today. Next slide, please. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this topic, and I feel like I'm resting on the shoulders or standing on the shoulders of all the folks that we've heard mentioned, certainly Elana, Carolyn, and Lindsay Goldman, who did that really critical work back in 2014 that I think remains kind of a standout piece in terms of understanding this intersection. And yet there's just so much more to explore, which kind of gave rise to my interest that ultimately led to this book, which I'll talk about. So next slide, please. I want to begin with a quick just notice on who I am and who we are as an organization. I work for National Housing Trust. We're a national nonprofit based in the DC area, but we work nationally. We're a developer of affordable housing. We're also a policy shop. So really, we kind of like to believe that we are walking the walk and talking the talk when it comes to really trying to advance solutions that respond to climate change, particularly in the places where people call home. Next slide, please. But the real thing that we're here to talk today about, that I'm here to talk about, is this intersection between these two trends that we know are happening. Certainly, you all are very familiar already with the aging of our population, and you've seen ample evidence in your region of our changing climate, both of which have the potential to really radically disrupt how we think about building communities and serving the people who live in them. But they differ in the degree to which they are apparent to some. For some, there's very little doubt that climate change is happening. We already endure summers that are characterized by code red air quality days and winters by either too much or too little snowpack. Extreme heat and cold are becoming commonplace. Hurricanes, as you all know, are increasingly frequent, intense, and deadly. And New York, like many other parts of the world, are confronting periods of extreme rainfall and wildfire smoke in ways that are truly unprecedented. Next slide, please. We see clear evidence of the impacts of climate change and the destruction that it leaves behind. Here in the US, NOAA tracks disasters, the government agency tracks disasters, nearly all of which are climate fueled, and all of which have resulted in at least $1 billion of damage. The number of these $1 billion disasters has increased each year. A decade ago, the average was about 8 per year. Last year, there were 18, and this year we're already at 23, and hurricane season hasn't yet ended. And the disasters really represent the full array of wildfires, storms, flooding, hurricanes, cold waves, and droughts, and reach nearly all parts of our country. We see time and time again that events of this scale lead to the loss of life and devastation of homes and communities that will take years to recover from in some cases. Thankfully, the flooding that took place in New York City in late September didn't result in the same death toll that arose a few years ago in Hurricane Ida. And it might have been in part because we've made some incremental progress, in this case, via improved notifications. But the reality is that even in that flood, which did not rise to the level of $1 billion disaster, still damaged properties, homes, displaced people, many of whom are already struggling to find affordable places to live. Next slide, please. And this climate change, of course, intersects with one that you all understand, but not everyone does. It's less talked about, it's less apparent, but it's going to have a huge impact on who we are as a country. 100 years ago, 1 in 20 people was over 65. Today, roughly 1 in 6 is. And older adults are the fastest growing demographic in the US. Advance, please. By 2034, there'll be more people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. And that is increasingly a diverse group of people with far higher growth rates among non-white populations than white older adults. In New York, nearly 18% of people who live in the state are over 65. Between 2010 and 2020, the number of older adults grew by 30% in the state. So this change really represents a significant tipping point among a very sizable share of our population. And it's one that really, frankly, doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And as a result, many community leaders and advocates are left with a poor understanding of what that shift means and what older adults' needs are. Next slide, please. I feel like I may be preaching to the choir a little bit here, but you can just advance through those next bullet points. You know, a lot of people don't have a great understanding of what it means to be an older adult. When does it even begin? Is it when age 50? Is it 62, 65, 55? We don't have a standard definition. And we also don't have a great understanding of what older adults' needs are, but there are some kind of universal truths across this cohort. Certainly 1 in 6 live at or near the poverty line. The vast majority of people do not live in congregate facilities and live independently in their homes. 1 in 5 don't drive. 1 in 9 live with dementia. 1 in 5 need help with activities of daily living. And even a higher share have some sort of ambulatory limitations. So it's really a shortfall for all of us when we acknowledge these realities and use them to inform and guide our work, particularly as it relates to climate resilience. Next slide, please. So we've got these 2 big trends underway, each of which has their own institutions that work to address them. Engineers, data analysts, climatologists, and emergency managers kind of on one side, and on another, healthcare, gerontologists, demographers, and aging advocates. And this is therein lies the rub, that we have these 2 very complex challenges and 2 very distinct and often separate ways of addressing them. It's that intersection between them, I think, that merits more attention. There's just not enough focus on how and where climate change exacerbates risk for older adults and what that means for communities that are home to an increasingly large share of them. Next slide, please. By all accounts, we're not doing a great job of planning communities that work well for older adults. I think that's informed by our lack of understanding, for the most part, of what older adults' needs are. And it's also contributed to by the siloed approach to problem solving that gives us these blind spots, that results in these blind spots, wherein we're creating places that lack adequate benches and parks and adequate seating and shading at bus stops. We're not providing enough safe, affordable, accessible housing. We don't offer enough reliable, accessible, affordable choice in how to get around safely once a person stops driving. And you definitely see it in the ways in which we fail to protect older adults during COVID. There's so much work to be done, and I'll credit AARP's Livable Communities program and its state offices, one of which Robyn represents, for doing so much great work on this topic over the years. Not to mention the work underway across 700 age-friendly communities and states, many of which are in New York State there. But there's a lot more to do to address the blind spots that we have about what it means to age in place, particularly when we think about climate-fueled disasters. Next slide, please. In this situation, thank you, it becomes really painfully clear that we are failing to create communities that safeguard older adults in their times of greatest need. We know that the impact of Superstorm Sandy on older New Yorkers was clear, but the sad reality is that trend is mirrored across a number of disasters all across this country. Thank you, it's perfect. And the reality is that older adults time and time again bear the brunt of climate change. They represent, twice, 3 times, even 5 times as much of the deaths compared to the fact that older adults represent less than 20% of the population in most cases. This trend line that you see here over nearly 20 years, next slide, please, or one more advance, there you go, makes it really painfully clear that we are not creating communities that safeguard older adults in their time of greatest need. And it's not like we haven't been told this was happening. A lot of these events were coupled with news stories after the fact. Again, I'll credit NYAM for its really, really important work after Superstorm Sandy in documenting that intersection and the impacts on older adults, examining what New York City leaders needed to learn from the tragedies of Sandy so that we could avoid similar outcomes in the future. At the time, NYAM developed 12 recommendations, which is again the precursor to the report that we just heard about from Carolyn and Elana, many of which remain relevant today. And NYAM has led efforts to guide the state's age-friendly communities to better think about how to incorporate those recommendations in their age-friendly planning. But at a national level, there has not been a similar attention and focus. We just haven't made it a priority to solve this problem. Next slide, please. And it's not just in disasters that older adults are disproportionately impacted. It's also the case that in our new normal, climate change is having a more serious effect on the health and financial situation for older adults. We just completed our hottest summer ever on record on Earth, and a summer of intermittent wildfire smoke entering into the Northeast in ways that it never has before. The reality is that these effects impact all of us, but not all of us in the same way. For people with chronic health conditions, as is the case for many older adults, these conditions can be deadly. People with respiratory challenges are particularly vulnerable to the smoke from fires and from black mold found in homes that have been flooded. And for those who are overweight or diabetic, dust from drought and fires can increase the risk of heart attack. Extreme heat, as you see here, is now the most deadly of all weather-related illnesses, leading to 12,000 deaths each year, of which 80% are people over 60. We saw this in stark relief in the Pacific Northwest in heat waves of 2021, where 1,000 people died in the most impacted county. The average age was 67. Next slide, please. And it's not just the health effects that make climate change more dangerous for older adults. It also intersects with their often precarious financial situations that add to their vulnerability. With more extreme temperatures, the cost of keeping homes sufficiently cool or warm rises. We have to run the AC or heater longer and face higher utility bills as a result. For low-income, older adult-headed households who already struggle to pay for utilities, these additional costs represent an even greater burden. AARP reports that nearly 1 in 5 went without basic necessities for at least 1 month to pay an energy bill. Our new normal means that someone suffering in a home or apartment that is too cold or too hot is forced to make real-time decisions about how much they can afford and how much discomfort they can withstand. And I see the note about the audio. I apologize. I'll try to do better. More demand for heating and cooling places a greater strain on the grid, leading to longer and more frequent blackouts in areas where these are commonplace, and especially for people who need to keep in-home medical equipment operational. Even greater costs arise when they need to procure generators or alternate power sources. And finally, flood and wildfire insurance premiums are increasing as we develop more data-informed projections about risk. FEMA is phasing in these challenges, but it still means that some homeowners will see their premiums increase 18% every year for more than a decade. In real terms, that means that someone in Florida who pays $1,053 now per year will see those costs jump to $4,000 or more. These costs are hard to bear, particularly for people who already struggle to just afford the cost of their mortgage or rent, as is the case for a third of older homeowners and many more renters. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? I'm hoping that's the question you're asking. Certainly it caused me to wonder, how can we begin to turn the tide on these trends that compound risks for older adults, making them more vulnerable? For me, I felt that I could make a contribution by diving into the topic, which ultimately resulted in this book. Next slide, please. First, that led to me having sort of three big takeaways that I'll go through in turn. First, we have to be clear-eyed in our understanding about how climate change is affecting older adults and accept that in many cases, it does impact them more greatly. This should start with a commitment to understanding, again, who older adults are and what their needs are. Imagine the difference in needs between a healthy, engaged, financially secure 62-year-old and an 89-year-old living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical challenges and no savings, or a grandparent living comfortably in an intergenerational home with children and their family, compared to one who's caretaking for an adult child with a disability or a spouse with dementia. Older adults are a varied group in terms of ages and abilities, and more racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse every year. Layering on top of this understanding, an additional understanding of how these many conditions intersect with climate risks becomes essential foundational work. My second takeaway is that we need to recognize that individual and even institutional preparedness is important, but it is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from my research is that these lives lost in disasters aren't often the result of a failure of individuals to prepare. More often, they are the result of unrealistic expectations about what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on a fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who lives with dementia. The shortcomings of preparedness are amplified by systems-wide failures in notifications, transportation, emergency response, and much more that impact everyone, but especially older adults, and which can be offset by greater investment in some of the strategies that Elana described before, and by greater investment in community-based organizations. Finally, my final takeaway is that we must cultivate a greater commitment to community-wide resilience that is centered in the needs of older adults. Doing so would create an opportunity for a diverse array of sectors to participate, back to those partnerships that Elana spoke of. We need to foster greater coordination among emergency managers, housing advocates, transportation planners, healthcare providers, utilities, and many more in order to reduce risk. It's a job that is not just for any one sector. A job of this magnitude really needs to be a job for everyone. In fact, I would argue that it is the job as we all think about older adults in our lives, or the kinds of communities that we want to live in as we age. Next slide, please. So what would it look like to create a more climate resilient community rooted in the needs of older adults? It would certainly include better infrastructure investments in things like seawalls, stormwater capture systems, and a more resilient grid. But it would also include more thoughtful approaches to housing, especially in age-restricted housing, through stronger building codes and zoning reform that encourages smaller, denser housing that reduces utility consumption and fosters that important level of connection among residents that we heard about earlier. It would support a more diverse transportation network, including public transit, paratransit, volunteer driver programs, biking and walking, to address the fact that 1 in 5 people over 65 don't drive. A climate resilient community would also include multiple modes of communicating about disasters, keeping in mind the significant share of older adults who aren't internet savvy, or who live with disabilities, or who speak a language other than English. Next slide, please. I dove deep in the book on New York State as a really important work in progress, not only because of the important work that NYAM has led in the past, but also because, next slide, or please advance, because New York State is the first age-friendly state in our country, committing to the idea that New York will be a safe place for people to age as they grow older. New York has been at this for several years now and spawned dozens of age-friendly communities across the state. But even with that thoughtful leadership, they fail to expressly consider climate impacts on health, on housing, and more. Similarly, New York State is a national leader in climate solutions. They seek to lead the country in carbon reduction emissions and activate all of the levers of the state government to address the risks of climate change. But their notion of climate justice fails to expressly account for older adults. So there's this gap between even a wonderful example like New York State and the critical importance to bring those two things together. I believe that the Master Plan for Aging currently underway now by DOH and NYSOFA is a really important opportunity to connect those dots so that age-friendly work is responding to climate challenges and the climate work is responding to the needs of older adults. Next slide, please. With all that said, I want to thank you for taking the time to learn about this topic. Because when we begin to center resilience in the needs of older adults, we start to solve for other needs. We solve for the needs of people on limited incomes or who can't drive, or who live with disabilities. We solve for those who are often overlooked and not heard because they are isolated, either by choice or circumstance. And we solve for the needs of our future selves by creating systems that better account for changing abilities, needs, and risks as we age. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Elana.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you in particular for being the bridge between the aging and the climate communities. And I forgot to mention at the start that I have your book, and I'm excited to read it. I just got it in the mail.
Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. And we will send out information to order the book, and then of course for the report and everything following up in an email. So thank you. And now I want to turn it over to Robyn Haberman of AARP New York to talk about a really impressive toolkit that AARP has on a similar theme.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. If we could advance the slide one, perfect. I am with AARP New York. AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people 50 or older to choose how they live as they age. Our Livable Communities initiatives support efforts to make communities more livable and age-friendly. And among those programs are the AARP network of age-friendly states and communities, which Danielle mentioned, with which there are 37 in New York. And we invite all of you to learn more about that if you want to get your community involved. And another part of that Livable Communities initiative is a recently released Disaster Resilience Toolkit, which I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. And we shared some of this data, you heard it from Danielle and Elana, but older adults are making up a larger share of our state's population than ever before, with the 65 and over population growing by more than 800,000 over the past decade, even as the under 55 population shrunk by nearly 500,000. So today, nearly 1 in 5 New Yorkers is 65 and above, which is 18%, and a larger share than ever before. The studies that we've done with the Center for Urban Future also reveal increasing diversity in the 65 plus population and an alarming rise in the poverty rate among older New Yorkers. These trends have profound implications for emergency management, especially as floods, droughts, wildfires, tornadoes, heat waves, hurricanes, and other hazards and disruptive events do become more common and more severe, as we're seeing in the news cycle, unfortunately, more and more. Next slide, please. A growing body of evidence confirms that older adults are disproportionately impacted during disasters. They suffer a disproportionate share of fatalities resulting from those disasters, and they also face lasting consequences for their physical and mental health, economic security, and overall well-being. In addition, older adults are especially vulnerable during public health crises, as we saw with COVID-19, and improved emergency planning and community-wide resilience at the local level can go a long way towards addressing the impact of disasters on older adults. That's why AARP's Livable Communities Office teamed up with FEMA to produce a resource that communities and local leaders can use to reduce risks and better protect older adults. All of the information I'm sharing with you today really comes primarily from that Disaster Resilience Toolkit, and I think Elana is going to be sending a link where you can download that or order a copy after this program, so you can definitely take a look. It's got a lot of fantastic information that you can bring to your own work in your own local community. Next slide, please. A key to ensuring that older adults are properly served by disaster preparedness and emergency planning is to acknowledge and address the gaps that exist between local emergency management teams and the organizations and municipal offices that work with older community members. Integrated disaster planning will help local governments protect all older residents. AARP and FEMA, identifies 3 reasons for the gap. One is a lack of communication and coordination. Facilitating earlier engagement and partnerships between emergency management teams and aging services professionals will ensure both are ready to collaborate if or when disaster strikes. We also see an absence of a common technical language. Too little interaction between the systems and logistics-focused emergency managers and the providers who understand the needs of older residents means they're not speaking the same language all the time. And 3, an emphasis on institutional older adults. I think Danielle referred to this. While leaders and providers are rightly concerned about the needs of people living in nursing homes and other institutional settings, those residents are not representative of all older adults. In fact, only 2.3% of older people living in nursing homes and another 1.5% reside in assisted living facilities. That leaves the vast majority of older adults who live independently, but might lack the ability to evacuate an area, secure their property, or safely shelter in place without assistance. Next slide, please. I think we got one more. I think I might be behind one. One more. Perfect. Thank you. The Disaster Resilience Toolkit was created because coordinated education and outreach can bridge a community's emergency response and resilience gaps. When all parties understand the diverse needs of older adults, plans and procedures will be more effective at protecting residents from harm and saving lives. Bringing partners together can reduce the risks that older adults face, and along with people of all ages. Emergency management experts embrace the notion of a disaster life cycle, which divides disaster planning into 4 phases. The first is mitigation, which is making a community less vulnerable. That might include improving public infrastructure, building fire-resistant structures, changing zoning laws, or adopting hazard-resistant building codes. 2 would be preparedness, education, training, outreach that improve the ability of a community to respond to a disaster. That might include instructing residents on what to stock up on in terms of supplies in case of an emergency, training community members in emergency protocols, or developing communication plans that can reach a wide, diverse population. 3 is response, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, saving lives, searching for missing people, ensuring they have access to food and water, and limiting property damage. And then, of course, recovery. Once the immediate danger has passed, cleanup, damage assessment, restoration of utilities, and the start of structural repairs. Recovery requires careful planning to address long-term needs, including housing, employment, economic development, and rebuilding. But smart recovery work seeks to rebuild in a way that reduces future risks for disasters that might be coming down the road. All of these 4 phases can be enhanced by a commitment to becoming more resilient. And building community resilience among older adults requires that local leaders are aware of the specific needs that they have and the impacts on older people of typical natural disasters, unexpected outages, weather trends like temperature extremes that we're seeing more and more. The inclusion of older adults among other historically underrepresented populations in disaster resiliency planning increases the probability of more equitable disaster responses. You can see in this slide, I think Danielle referred to some of the same events that we've seen here. Consequences tend to be harder on older adults than on younger age groups, specifically in New York. When Hurricane Sandy struck the tri-state area, almost half of the fatalities were among people aged 65 and older. There are several reasons older residents are at a disproportionately high risk. Mobility difficulties can make it harder to get out of harm's way. A lack of access to transportation. Social isolation if there are no friends or family nearby to help them. They may be reluctant to leave a pet behind, and many older adults lack cell phones or internet access, and so they don't get real-time information about changing weather or emergency conditions, available resources, or how to find help. Many older adults also lack the financial means to prepare for disasters or relocate. Often they're on fixed incomes and lack cash to stock up on food and prescriptions, let alone make their home more disaster resilient. Older homes in many parts of the US don't have air conditioning because until recently, we didn't need it as much. Heating a home in New York can be similarly challenging. In 2015, approximately 1.6 million people aged 50 or older could not afford the heating fuel, electricity, or natural gas necessary to heat their homes. And while hurricanes, wildfires, and floods make headlines on a regular basis, they're not the deadliest. That distinction goes to extreme heat, which causes the most weather-related deaths in the nation. Homes built before the 1990s, when energy efficiency standards were updated, might lack the insulation necessary to keep their occupants safe and comfortable. And cities also tend to be hotter than the surrounding area because they have more pavement that retains heat and fewer trees, which cool the air and provide shade. And while heat impacts urban residents of all ages, older adults, people of color, and the residents of lower income neighborhoods often bear the brunt of this effect due to historical land use policies, some of which were racially motivated. Formerly red line neighborhoods have half as many trees today on average as other more affluent neighborhoods. To that end, New York State is actually currently working on an extreme heat action plan. Final recommendations are expected to be released in April of 2024, but the preliminary report is out, and you can find that online if you just Google New York State Extreme Heat Action Plan. And I can also send a link to Elana to share with all of you later. Next slide, please. Thank you. In the days after an immediate danger has passed, older residents and low-income households can quickly spin into a downward spiral. Rescues become hard to come by due to demand and access challenges. Power goes out either during a heat wave or a cold snap. There are a lot of complications if you can't refrigerate your medicine or your pipes burst. Those all can get dangerous very quickly. Repair assistance can become difficult to secure due to demand for contractors, shortage of supplies, and for some, a lack of home ownership documents. The need to request assistance online can be a challenge if you're not familiar with the internet or if you don't have access. Broadband remains a challenge in many parts of rural New York. Next slide, please. So the following 5 recommendations can serve as a starting point for local leaders and community advocates. The first is to make the right connections and build relationships. I hope that's a little bit of what we're doing here today. But long before a disaster happens, people charged with emergency response and disaster recovery need to know the people who work with older residents and the organizations that already play a frontline role in responding to everyday needs, regardless of whether they live independently or in a facility. Finding trusted partners, building a broad coalition, including older adults as contributors. It's really important to engage older adults as conscious stakeholders in disaster settings, rather than dismissing them as passive victims. Next slide, please. Strategy 2 is to identify where older adults are and how to reach them. NYAM is doing great work with that mapping in New York City because there's generally a poor level of understanding about where older adults reside and how best to reach them. Emergency plans often limit responders' considerations to the needs of people in nursing homes. To reduce the risks of older adults, emergency managers need to know where to find older residents who might need help and how to keep them informed. A lot of them do still rely on older school standbys like TV, radio news, landline telephones, and postal mail. FEMA's broad mandate also includes hazard mitigation planning, which is the key to breaking the cycle of disaster damage and reconstruction. And that's really an important opportunity to articulate the needs of older adults when that planning process is ongoing. Organizations that serve them can contribute data, insights, and expertise. And again, communities enrolled in AARP's network of age-friendly states and communities have age-friendly committees and action plans that can augment local planning. Next slide, please. Seek and include diverse perspectives. This is so important. Resilience strategies for older adults are often ineffective if they fail to account for the demographics diversity of race, ethnicity, faith, income, wellness, physical and cognitive abilities, and even their age. By collaborating with community-based groups that understand the needs of a diverse older population is critical. We have to acknowledge the needs gap, that an adult in their 60s might have very different needs than an adult in their 90s. Engage a diverse group of stakeholders. Outreach should be done in a manner, language, and format that respects differences, and when possible, through trusted intermediary organizations. Besides making individuals more vulnerable to the impact of disasters, legacies of poverty and racism can make it harder for certain communities to access funding for disaster mitigation and recovery. One longstanding source of this disparity is the prevalence of informal property ownership norms among certain marginalized populations. There's really some deep-seated inequities that need to be considered throughout any disaster planning and recovery process. Next slide, please. I know we have just another minute. Be mindful of response and relocation risks. During disaster or emergency event, residents may shelter in place or they may evacuate. The risks of staying put may seem obvious, but many older adults hunker down even when urged to flee. They may believe they can withstand an emergency. They may fear the cost and risks of relocation might outweigh the risk of staying. They might have anxiety about abandoning their home. They might not want to leave a pet behind, and they might be uncomfortable sheltering with others in the public setting. Issues of health and disability can also play a role in that. If they don't have access to their medications, special diets, medical equipment, Often the question of whether to stay home or evacuate isn't a choice at all because many older adults lack access to transportation. So it's important to keep the power running, even in homes when people have been told to evacuate, keep the phone lines on. Cell phones are great until the batteries go out, so landlines should remain active as long as possible. Ensure that emergency shelters are safe and welcoming for people of different physical and cognitive abilities and make them comfortable for people with varying needs. Next slide, please. Strengthen community-wide infrastructure. Hazard mitigation investments involving private land or public spaces are an essential part of enhancing disaster resilience, as are policies that seek to reduce risk, but it's also important to consider other aspects of community infrastructure, like expanding high-speed internet access. New York is currently undergoing the Connect All project to map broadband access and determine where those gaps in coverage are, ensure mobility options, protect needed natural resources, making water sources always available, planting trees on public lands, and enhancing tree canopies, and helping residents weather the weather, connecting low-income households to HEAP. And the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act include funding for the weatherization assistance to reduce energy costs for low-income households. Renovations of schools and community centers should enable them to be deployed as cooling centers or emergency shelters when needed. Next slide, please. I'm going to wrap it up because I know this webinar is going quick, but the AARP Disaster Resilience Toolkit really does identify a range of issues to consider as a community works towards enhancing disaster resilience. If we create communities that reduce risks for older adults, it means we have created safer places for residents of all ages. By evaluating and reevaluating disaster response and emergency management from the perspective of older adults, communities can better ensure that all residents are better protected. We're likely, unfortunately, to face more intense, frequent, and destructive disasters in the future, but there are clear and actionable steps that communities can take now to lower the risks that older adults face. Thank you so much to NYAM and to all of you for tuning in. I'm going to pause there. You can find the Disaster Resilience Toolkit online, but we'll see what questions people have.
Thank you so much, Robyn. And one kind of theme I was noticing both with your and Danielle's presentation is that so many of the recommendations really help people of all ages. Like some might be more kind of leaning a little bit, but really and we talk about this a lot at NYAM with our age-friendly work, is that age-friendly changes often are just supportive of everybody. So it's a way of kind of, when people are not necessarily thinking that aging space the way that we all are, it's a way to encourage that, right? It can actually help you too. So I just want to thank you very much for this information, and the photographs in particular really drive the point home that this is real, this is happening, it has been happening, it will continue to, and so we just have to figure out how to deal with it. So there are some really good questions in the chat, and Robyn, the first one to you, but Danielle, please feel free to chime in as well. And this is something that I've really kind of was struggling with, because a lot of the recommendations that we had were kind of more focused on older adults that are already connected with older adult centers and the like, because that's where we did our focus groups. But many older adults are not affiliated with different, organizations or senior centers, or they're just living their lives, and that's great. But how do we get the information out to people that are not necessarily affiliated? And actually somebody in the chat suggested already, churches and other places of worship, street fairs. And Robyn, I'm asking you because AARP, I know, really kind of does do work with a lot of different older adults. What are some kind of suggestions that you have?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a magic bullet solution to that, but I think it really is getting out into the community, listening, showing up in places where people are. It might not be a community center. It might be at a fair, festival, or in a park, or just, even wherever people are gathering. Those are the places where you can find people. But like she said, knowing the demographics of community, talking to community leaders about where the people they serve are. If you talk to the leaders of any religious organization, they're going to know where you can find the people who maybe belong to those organizations. There's so many different amazing nonprofits and community-based organizations doing work on the ground that by reaching out to all of those local leaders, they really know the community on a finer level, on a more they can kind of take a deeper dive into the community. So it's really just that outreach and putting the legwork in to find people and meet them where they're at.
Yep, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think another thing also, and again, probably everyone on this webinar is connected to older people in their lives. And that's another way to get out the information, is to just make sure that the people in your life and in your family are connected and educated about whatever the topic is. Danielle, there was a comment that said, please be a guest on The View to get the word out on your book. So if anyone has connections to The View or any other talk shows or NBC or anything, please let us know in the chat, because I completely agree. Maybe we could do, the three of us can do a roadshow.
Love it.
But the question is, which other regions or states have shown promising investment in age-friendly informed climate change preparedness?
Yeah, I get asked that question a good amount, and I'll say honestly, it's not like I have a long list hidden in my back pocket that I keep for this question. The reality is that it's kind of a nascent issue. It's kind of a nascent field of work, and that I do focus on 3 communities in particular in the book, one of which is New York State. I look at also at City of Portland and the County of Multnomah County in Oregon.
Okay.
In part because that city-county relationship is kind of instructive in interesting ways too. As you may know, the county is often the unit of government that leads the Older Americans Act funding, and it's overseeing the work of the AAAs. Is often the entity that oversees emergency management. And yet a lot of the city-led services, some of the city-led infrastructure decisions are made at the city level, not the county. So, talking about how Portland, for example, has intentionally built bridges between the city and county because through its age-friendly work, truly has really been an important, I think, lesson for this work. And it shows a lot of promise going forward. The other community is New Orleans. And I would say New Orleans is not an age-friendly community. They have not necessarily made older adults a focus, but they have been in such a, they've been in harm's way so many times that they live with disaster and climate risks all the time now. And they've begun to, I think, implement some really important programs that can be instructive. They've given a lot of thought to what an effective special needs registry looks like. What does it need to be? How does it need to be implemented? Should it be done with digital signups? Should it be done manually? Do we ask people to recertify every 6 months? All of these approaches, when you go to actually implement a program like that could help to mitigate some of the risk older adults face. I feel like they've been able to pilot some of the things that work and don't work. Another really fabulous example out of New Orleans is this community lighthouse model that they've piloted, where they use faith-based houses of worship coupled with the city to create resilience hubs throughout the community. And that's done certainly where older adults live. They know that they're, easily accessible, walking distance, a few blocks away. It's a place where older adults can go and get cooling or heating, depending on the risk. They can recharge their phones, they can get water, medical care. And the thing about that is they also know where those older adults live well before disaster strikes. So the community, the lighthouses also have an ongoing relationship with older adults, so that it's woven into really how the community operates. So they're living with this climate risk every day, and they're taking steps to account for it.
That's awesome. Are there resilience hubs in New York City?
I don't know the answer to that, to be perfectly honest. I wouldn't be surprised if there are. I would say it is a model that is getting more frequently used. Oftentimes, it's very naturally suited to a senior center or to a community center.
Right, and there certainly are cooling centers, I know, in New York City.
But this is more of like a full functioning, how do you layer on renewable energy onto it so you have power when the grid goes down, you have emergency food and water. And the important thing, though, is that people know how to get there, and they are familiar with it before that time comes. Because I was just in upstate New York a couple weeks ago talking with Tompkins County, and they were talking about, they offered a cooling center in one of their more recent climate challenge, heat waves. And they said one person showed up. So, must not work. But I don't think that they'd really understood the transportation challenges. If you're not locating it well, if you're not solving for that transportation access question, then it's not going to work as well as it should. So it needs to be a really comprehensive approach.
Yep, definitely. There's a question. I'm a nurse care manager at a large New York City hospital and speak with older patients regarding emergency preparedness. Do you know of any assessment that exists to help evaluate an older patient's level of emergency preparedness? It's a great question.
I do actually.
Even
So
better.
the Veterans Assistance Agency, VA,
Yeah.
has a checklist that they use for in-home medical visits, and what they've actually done a good job, not just of assessing the sort of health and well-being of the veteran, but looking beyond that to see are there things in place to address other risks. So, for example, is there an air purifier? Is there backup power? Are there other risks in place that that person should be thinking about or contemplating when they're really thinking about their health holistically? I'm not going to say it's perfect, but that is the one tool that I was informed about that is a good model, I think, to build on.
And that's really good to know. And I'm just going to put in the chat for everyone that one of our webinar participants also has, it looks like, a household emergency preparedness instrument development. So I just put that in. Hopefully everyone can see that. And then my next question was, oh, this is really for everyone or for all of us. How can we encourage an intergenerational climate action movement? Right now, the climate movement, often we think of as kind of the younger generation, or it's siloed. So, but of course, there's power in numbers and in intergenerational activity. So, have you seen that, or do you have any recommendations for how we can go about fomenting that? Oh, you're on mute, Robyn.
Yes, I unmuted and then muted immediately. So a couple of things. One, I just, I do want to say that I was at the state capitol during the legislative session last year, and there was a huge climate change rally going on. And I did see that there were people of all ages. So I would challenge that there aren't older adults who are concerned about climate change. I am not quite AARP age yet, but I'm rapidly approaching it. I'm definitely Generation X, and I do know that that is not something that we are not passionate about to a certain degree. I would also say that New York State right now, I think it's been mentioned, we're working on the master plan for aging, and there's a lot of stakeholders in those meetings, and in all of the proposed solution documents, there's a number of questions that break down what are you proposing, why, what impact will it have, but there in every single one it says what is the impact of climate change on based on this proposal. So it's being talked about kind of on a more macro level now. I think it's becoming more part of our everyday language. So I don't know about, getting more champions and advocates, of everyday people, but I do know that more champions and advocates are talking about this when it comes to policy and planning, if that makes sense.
Yep.
That's great. Glad to hear about that, the master plan. I would say, there are a lot of groups out there that cultivate climate leadership among older adults. So Climate Elder Justice Coalition and Grandmothers for Climate Action and others are these sort of climate groups that have spurred up and led by Bill McKibben and Third Act and all of the work that he's done really to engage older adults in climate. I do think that there's a real natural synergy in connecting the dots between younger and older generations around this work. I think you're right. There's a lot of preconceptions that older adults don't care, or frankly, that older adults are to blame for climate change. And so therefore, we're not going to enlist them. The reality is that there's thousands of people who want to be a part of the solution, if not millions. And it's just a matter of creating those platforms and those tables where you can invite people to work together.
So relatedly, and this will be our last question, how can any of us as individuals help to increase either local, state, or national focus, specifically on disaster preparedness as relates to older adults?
I would say, local advocacy is anything you want it to be. You can go talk to your city council, your town council, your elected officials, make your voice heard. I think the more people do that, especially at the local level, the more gets done. So if you went to your town board meeting and said, what are we doing about this? Maybe they have a really great answer and they're working on it and you can hear what the plan is and weigh in on it, or maybe they're not, and you can spur that action and push that forward. The Disaster Resilience Toolkit is a really great place to start if you're looking to initiate this work in your own community, or at least review it with someone. But I think start local on the ground, because that's how it rises to the top.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with everything Robyn said. And I would say too that I think there's an opportunity to press local leaders to make sure that when they're making decisions about public services or infrastructure, that they are both considering the needs of older adults and the impacts of climate change. And I think it comes down to questions around even like zoning reform. Are we going to allow more multifamily housing to be developed? Yes or no? Well, we should, for the following reasons. It serves elder needs better. It's a better climate response solution, both mitigation and adaptation side. Similarly for public transit, making sure that we have a robust public transit system that works is great on an everyday basis. It's a part of the climate solution, and it's going to make your community more resilient and reduce the risk of older adults who might otherwise be alienated and stuck, particularly when they stop driving. So I would say the lesson there is, press on decisions that are being made at the local level to ensure that they are adequately considering how does this investment make us more resilient as a community, both in the face of climate change and to account for a growing share of older adults.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing on that. Even before someone is elected into office, there's often town halls, there's often debates and candidate forums. Bring that question to them. Put all the candidates on the spot. Say, what are you doing? If you're in office, what are you doing about climate change and what are you doing about resilience? See what their answers are and vote accordingly. And make sure it's on their radar,
We
because
have
if
local
people are
city elections
asking
coming
them
up on
about
November
it, they're going
7th.
to have to start addressing it.
We obviously haven't made, but
I said if people start asking about it more frequently, they are going to have to start addressing it so that they have a answer that sounds good when they're talking to you. And, that's how we hold them accountable with our votes.
That's right. That's right. Great. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we do need to wrap up. So I just want to, first of all, thank you, Danielle and Robyn, not only for being here today and sharing your insight and wisdom, but for really just the work that you do every day on this and other topics. And I also just want to thank the rest of my team who were so instrumental in developing this report and in this webinar and in all of this work. And specifically, as you already met, Carolyn Stem and Grace Morton and Musa Hussein and Clara Schur and Gina Ravosa and Nicole Zhang. And then we also had some people that worked at NYAM that are no longer working at NYAM, but were really had a huge impact on this work, specifically Mario Rubano, Holly Riccio, and Andrea Deep. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us, and all of our contact information is right here. Please contact us. Please share resources you have, more questions that you have, ideas. We obviously have a lot of work to do, but we are just going to do it because we have to. So I just want to thank you all and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.